Tengo el honor y el...
Good morning. I have the honor and the privilege to introduce you to our next speaker.
Como os decía, me siento muy contenta.
As I said, it is an honor for me to introduce you to our next speaker.
Olga, y es que de repente se me va la cabeza. Olga Rodríguez Francisco.
Olga Rodríguez Francisco. I like to say the name of the mothers, always the surname of the mothers, Francisco in this case. She's a journalist, she's a writer, an activist, a feminist, and I don't know what else to say about her. She's a great person, and recently she's co-written the script of the film En los márgenes, in the margins, that's been just presented in Spain. She has written many books, but most of all, she's specialized in the exodus, the tragedies of the people in the contemporary world in the last 30 years. And we have all known about that thanks to the press news. She's also a very active press collaborator, and she has been in all of the countries where there's been a conflict, from Iraq to Palestine, Afghanistan, Morocco, Alger.
Ucrania recientemente, acaba de regresar hace unos días.
Ukraine, she came back from Ukraine a couple of days ago. She's going to tell us about that. But something else I would like to highlight is that she's very much involved in a platform for the recovery of one of the so many mass graves that we have in our country, in a village in León, Vilaldangos, where she has relatives, family members. She will refer to them later on as well. Without further delay, we're going to listen to Olga, and at the end, hopefully, there will be some time for questions or comments. Thank you. Welcome, Olga.
Hola, buenos días. Gracias.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Maria José, for being here. Thank you for allowing me to be here. And they asked me to talk about exodus in the world, so that's what I will do. I'm going to try to be brief. I'm going to show you pictures, my pictures, through which we can have a quick review of the situation in the world, of those exodus that can remind us so much of these desbandada in the Malaga-Almeria road that were ignored at their time, and before which there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of families that have been affected by them, and also the mothers and the children and their grandchildren, because as we know, as we very well know, repression, flight, exilium, violence and pain goes through several generations. Unfortunately, we can talk about it in the present time. I have brought some pictures from Afghanistan. The Afghan population has been, up to the last 3-4 years, the population with the highest number of refugees and with a longer lasting refugee movement after, of course, the Palestine population. The invasion and occupation of Afghanistan in 2001 by the hands of the American troops brought with it new exiles, apart from the ones that already existed, that were the consequence of the previous wars. And in that scenario, which for decades it's been a chess board where the powers, international powers, are fighting to have the greatest amount of influence in the region. So this Afghan population has crossed, in many cases, up to 6 frontiers and a sea to reach Europe. We have been ignoring them for years, until last year in the summer, when the troops left Afghanistan. Suddenly, for 3 or 4 months, it seemed like, public opinion. So the means of the media and certain governments were momentaneously interested in the situation of the Afghan population. This population have been rich in Europe for many years, and they are in this kind of limbo, and in many cases they are deported or live without the main fundamental rights in our own countries. And only for a moment during those months, and of course that was very much welcomed, but for some time, for a very short time, the rights of people were taken into account. Sometimes the rights of women are instrumentalized. It's like you can give them and take them away according to the geopolitical moment we are in. Here there are images of refugees in their own country. Kabul, for example, people that had come from the south of the country, Kandahar. This is also Kabul. So people that were trying to reach other destinations, and most of the Afghan refugees are in Iran, Pakistan, and Turkey. This is a refugees camp in the periphery of Kabul. This is a refugee camp that's been existing for decades. This picture was taken, I took it in 2004, and please remember it because I will tell you about one of the girls here that I met many years later. And here people live in houses made out of sticks and pieces of fabric, and they are helped by the Agency of the United Nations for Refugees, ACNUR. This is a school for refugee girls. This is refugee children. This is Afghan widows. They usually wear dress in white, and they just beg for some money at the entrances of church of mosques. The perpetuation of the war in Afghanistan and everything that's happened in these few years have brought with it new exiles and exodus. This is the Pansir Valley, where many wars and many battles have taken place. There's this idea that it is very quite inaccessible. These are Afghan women in one of the election processes that are queuing to vote. And in the year 2021, within the territory itself, there were 800,000 people that have been that have had to leave their country. It's a totally militarized one, and it's all conditioned by the introduction of weapons and armament that's been happening for decades, and it all increased much more since 2001. In total, 5 million refugee Afghans in Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey, mostly. This is a school for children, for refugees' children. The century started with this invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, and as a direct witness of it, something else followed, and it was the opening of hell on earth. And that was the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, where they threw, without mentioning Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hardest and the biggest bombs were thrown during those weeks in the face of the invasion of Iraq. I covered it from Baghdad, and these all changed the history and physiognomy of a country forever, and it broke and totally tore down the country and its society. This bombing phase provoked a very high number of casualties, of civil casualties. They bombed markets in Baghdad, in the Iraqi capital city, and there were corpses lying on the floor like carpets and rugs. There were doctors undergoing surgery on the floor, in the corridors at the entrance of hospitals, trying to save lives because there was not enough room or medical instrumentation to help all of those people. I was the direct witness of the killing of José Couso, and nowadays I keep an injury that comes from that attack, precisely. And as in many other places, before and after and more, because that is the modus operandi, the press was the objective also of those attacks. The British historian Hoddy Cosman says that in the First World War, 50% of victims were civil victims, and the other 50% were armed. Were part of the troops, part of the army. In World War II, the percentage of civil victims increased, and since the 90s, it was more than 90%. That is the percentage that is kept nowadays in all of the war conflicts around the world. So, at a moment in which we have high precision weapons, the most sophisticated ones you can have, ones that shouldn't fail, we have the highest percentages of civil victims in the last 100 years. So conclusions are very clear. And among those civil victims, we have the press and the media, with this impunity dynamic, which is so clear and with very apparent consequences, because if there are no direct witnesses of what's happening in a war conflict, then we cannot know what human rights are not being respected and which violations of those rights are taking place systematically, because we cannot have the evidence to document all those war crimes. And it's more and more difficult, and we're very conscious of it, because messages that are sent once and again is that, yes, we are a military objective. And this is something that I can tell you about that later on. We were identified press in the case of José Couso killing. The Pentagon and Colin Powell recognized later on that we were at a place that everybody knew the international press was, etc., etc. But still we were the target. For those few days, we could collect and identify many targets. And once the regime fell and the American troops reached the heart of Baghdad, and they chose the square called Paradise to bring down Saddam Hussein's statue. In each of the squares in Iraq were statues of Saddam Hussein, but that's where the Hotel Palestina was, and that's where the press were, and they chose it so that that tearing down of the statue was officially that image was officially disseminated. After that, there was a reintroduction of many weapons, and they established a quota system with which they gave the presidency of a country to a Shia, the Congress to a Sunni, and the presidents of the Congress to a Shia, and the power was distributed regarding quotas. And that was decided by United States and Bremer, who was a man allocated by Washington, and he self-established as the governor of Baghdad. During those days of violence, with the arrival of many European and foreign contractors to make their own business thanks to the war, that's when this opening of hell that I mentioned before started to happen, with thousands and thousands of that people. And an exodus that started in Iraq, but that still hasn't finished. Because a good proportion of Iraqis seek refuge in Syria. And that happened in 3 months, the massive arrival of Iraqis in Syria, a country of 24 million inhabitants then. And when Syria got into the war in 2011, again, they had to start another exodus. And these meant, well, they had Lebanon as a destination, later on Turkey, and finally something that was already known, because those who worked there and lived there knew that sooner or later many people would try to reach Europe, searching for a minimum level of dignity for their lives. Those days after the invasion and the occupation of Iraq, there was a lot of pillage in many Iraqi cities, and the American troops did nothing about it. I will never forget the Museum of Baghdad, for example, of the fire in Baghdad Library that held antique, very old documents that were very, very valuable. And in one of my articles, I said that it was that fire was trying to be put off thanks to two or three people and the person in charge of the library with a little bucket. And there were 3 American tanks in the corner. And I ran to tell them, can you not help? And they told me, we're following these orders of non-intervention. And that was the systematic answer we got the next few days for all the looting and pillaging that took place in the country. Then chaos came. This chaos cannot be attributed to not knowing what to do. It was something that was very well studied and seeked. This is a Paradise Square after the tearing down of the statue. The day in which that happened, on the 9th of April 2003, the day after the Americans attacked us, there was a soldier that went up the statue and put the flag for a few seconds there, which meant that this was an occupation. This was very polemic in the United States, and many part of the media censored it because it meant recognizing an occupation that they were denying. So they said, that they had gone there to free the Iraqi people and things like that. These are girls, Iraqi girls that had just got to Damascus, escaping from violence, persecution, repression. They started to kick the doors of many houses. At night, the disappearance and arrest and kidnapping of thousands of Iraqi men and women, and their total disappearance. So in some cases, it, of course, ended up in, or months later or years later, they would find their cadavers on the streets. In many other cases, the fortunate ones, they would come back to life because after being in secret American jails, they came out of which being other people. Kambuka was really terrible, for example. And they came out of there, and they were able to talk about it, to tell their story, with terrible side effects. In one of my books, "The Wet Man Doesn't Fear the Rain," they have it has this title because I tell the story of an Iraqi man that was arrested by the American troops with no charges, with no trial. And he was put in jail. His twin brother disappeared. He went through 11 American jails, Abu Ghraib and Kambuka as well. He was tortured. He had to go through all kinds of pressures. And when I met them sometime later in Damascus, after everybody thought they were dead, being twins, I could see them walking towards me. And one of them looked 30 years older than the other one. You could have perfectly noticed who had gone through those tortures and those secret jails. And this is the story that is part of so many families. This has happened in our contemporary history. And they got to Syria with those effects. I collected many testimonies of women who were in Abu Ghraib, women who were tortured, humiliated. In my book, I tell the story about Jamila Abbas and her daughter that was arrested when she was a minor, how they were tortured. Minal, Jamila's daughter, was afraid that they would rape her. They were in their pajamas, their nightgown, and she spent weeks with those clothes. And she had a pin, here, and she held it all the time, every night. And she thought, if they try to rape me, I will kill myself with this pin I have on my pajamas. Sometime later, she didn't know whether her mother was dead or alive, and we looked for her for months. And finally, we could get to know that she was in the secret jail of Abu Ghraib. When all those pictures came out, those pictures were what the Western world needed to make something credible. This was a secret that all of us knew. We knew that all of those people that left, the family members were talking about it, but they were not white, and they would just accuse these American troops. And finally, these pictures saw the light, and that was what they needed, so that the world would think that was all credible. It was a horror that had been taking place for a very long time.
So survivors in this state, very difficult, they arrived to Damascus in 2007, 2008, and they got settled in houses of people who were involved in solidarity networks that didn't have nothing to do with the institutions. Still, another of the consequences has been the Islamization of the society, because these conditions of poorness, of poverty, that start to appear in Syria, in Jordania, in Jordan, and across the borders. So they haven't disappeared. On the contrary, they are multiplying, and this is just the same camps that were settled for the Palestinian population. So those camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, or in Syria started being something like this. So small streets, very dark streets, because the same space that is allocated to the camps, to the tents, is the same space that was given to build the houses. So the original design, this square structure, is the result of the tents that were in place before. So we have camps like Shabra or Shatila in Lebanon that are unfortunately very well known. We're going to talk about the Palestinian population now, who are the refugees of longer time. As you know, in 1988, the first massive expulsion of Palestinian population by Israel took place, and this occupation has never stopped. It is in place every day. So every time I visit the Palestinian territories, I found new places that have been occupied, new places that has been joined to the Israeli territory. So as all the human rights organizations have acknowledged that there is a systemic discrimination against the Palestinian population that has no basic rights at the moment. This is a picture I took in Cisjordan, in a place that was allocated to the Palestinian government by the United Nations, but this has been occupied once again. So they built a checkpoint, so there is a series of civil Israeli columns that arrive. Then they just built this checkpoint, and then they start controlling the passing of Palestinian population through these checkpoints. So there is 4.6 million of Palestinian people, refugees. You know, there is the wall as well that is used to send out the Palestinian population. This is the entry to the city of Bethlehem. And the measures of control are more and more sophisticated. For instance, going to school for a Palestinian girl every morning can imply an impossible effort. I know girls who wake up at 4 in the morning with this hope, maybe today I can go if I make a very long queue to go to school. And, well, all the violence that is associated to all this. The fact that these fences, these controls are on a daily basis, it's a kind of discrimination and bad treatment that happens every day. This is the wall of entry to Bethlehem. May the peace be with you. That's what's written in the panel. This is one of the families that has to suffer this occupation and discrimination. Some of their children are dead or in jail. She's called Fatima. This is another family that at some point you see the roofs behind them. These roofs are from a colony that occupied the territory. A part of the garden of this family's house is used every day by the Israeli tanks. So every time they're going to cross, they just say, go into your houses, leave the garden, because we're going to cross. So this happens every day. He has his arm injured because he was beaten by the Israeli soldiers the day before when he was coming back from work. So that day, the bus wasn't coming, so he went there and asked for the bus, and he was beaten just like that. Yeah. That's the West Bank bombings in Gaza. Thousands of Palestinian people are dead from these attacks since, 9,000 people dead since 2000. This is the family that shows the road that these tanks cross every day and the colony that is in front of their home. And that was the day before, when the man who was beaten was just trying to recover a little bit. This is the checkpoint of Nablus, with a control as well, control point and checkpoint. Very often we can see how they take decisions without any reason, actually. I have pictures of an ambulance who arrives, for instance, with a pregnant woman that was giving birth, and it was stopped at the checkpoint, and the woman finally gave birth at the checkpoint. Of course, there is Palestinian population in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, as you know, and of course there is Palestinian population all around the world. Lebanon is another of the countries that that is affected by this exodus that arrives from Palestine. And this country is hosting many refugees from the war in Syria and before from the war in Iraq. It suffered also a bombing by Israel. For instance, you can see this neighborhood that was bombed in 2006. You have the militias here of the Christian phalanx. This phalanx is inspired, but the phalanx was here in Spain and Primo de Rivera. I hear voices there. Do you have questions? It's just comments. Okay. So you see here in the picture is the celebration, the tribute to the assassination of one of their leaders. And these are the militias in Beirut. This is a neighborhood of Palestinian refugees, mostly in Beirut, the neighborhood of Shatila, where there was also a killing at some point. More bombed houses, and of course the contrast you can find as in every warfare. But in Lebanon there are other worlds as well. So these places suffer conflicts and violence, but there are other sides of reality. You know, in Lebanon there has been a civil war during many years, and in the collective story of the population, you always have this contract. You suffer because of the war, but at the same time you look for escape, for another option, and try to enjoy, because there is always this possibility of dying or everything finishing. And you have other places where the Palestinian population takes part in political parties or factions or political parties that are allegedly armed. So here you can see that geography of these neighborhoods that were at the beginning refugees camp with tents, and then later on we have they have built houses, ones on top of the others, and with this network of all these wires, and of course without any essential service. You don't have a waste collection service, for instance. So basically these neighborhoods survive thanks to the agency, the humanitarian agency for the Palestinian population, which provides education and health services. And then you have all the neighborhoods that has been supported by Hezbollah or Iran, and that have been rebuilt, reconstructed. So in the framework of this flight that goes through Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, when in 2011 we have the Arab Spring, we have one of the most important examples in Egypt, this is the most populated Arab country in the world. It's a fascinating country. We also have the Suez Canal that goes through the country, and we have some agreements, the Camp David agreements. So all these are features of the country. And there is a peace agreement with Israel. So a truly free and democratic, very youth neighborhoods with secular population and with left-wing ideas, and all these social movements, they get in touch with the clandestine trade unions of the area of Majal al-Kuma, mostly, where there are factories where 24,000 workers are employed. So these workers face a very strong oppression, they don't have rights, and so they create these secret trade unions, and women are the leaders of these trade unions. In February in 2008, in the textile factories of Majala, they take the power, women take the power, and they say, we are here, where are the men? Because they were all going to go to make a strike, and at the very last minute, the men decide not to make the strike, and a group of women decide to continue with the strike, and they call upon the men, where are you? So this is the starting point of a wave of strikes that took place in Egypt that also explain the uprising of the Arab territory that have been called the Arab Springs. I don't like it, the Arab Spring here in Europe, because this term do not include the trade union movement. So during weeks, you have strikes all the time with all of the implications. And the link between these two movements gave place to interesting things. A very interesting civil resistance towards the dictatorship of Mubarak. Then we have the demonstrations of 2011, not only in the Tahrir Square, but in every city, in every municipality, and mainly in the cities where there are textile factories. And of course, there is a participation of men and women. And so the final consequence is the fallen of Mubarak, and from that date there is more oppression, more repression. And then when the war starts in Libya, some countries decide to intervene, and then the media focus goes from Egypt to Libya, and then Egypt becomes a very easy place for retaliation, and it was absolutely brutal. We were there and we saw shootings against the demonstrators, beatings, kidnappings. At the Tahrir Square, they took girls who were participating in a demonstration, and they took them to the basement of the Cairo Museum, and they were tortured. And they called this torture like a virginity test or exams, of course, without consent. And besides that, one of the commanders was interviewed at the CNN, and he said, well, those girls weren't like our daughters. So during those days, the representatives of the Western governments, of the European Union, they were shaking hands with the commanders of the military board that was in charge of Egypt, of the government. And they were satisfied, they said. And I remember there was an international Amnesty report claiming against these virginity examinations. The girls who denounced this were absolutely brave, and they even made statements and declarations in a country where this can imply a real stigma. So these are different images of demonstrations, Tahrir Square, workers of the factories. These are the bullets used by the government, bullets that killed people. There were thousands of people, thousands of casualties. And as you know, there were more shootings against demonstrations with more than 1,000 casualties in one single. Now we talk about Iraqi, Afghan, Syria, Palestinian, Egyptian, and Libyan population that joins into this exodus. And then we have the starting point to the journey in Europe. So all those who arrive, well, surprise, surprise, 2016, and there is refugees arriving into Europe as it was something new. Something we could already expect. So all these people is fleeing from wars, from repression, from the poverty and from the inequalities, just as so many people do, just like the African population does, and they are considered criminals because of that. So 2010, 2016, a lot of people arriving, for instance, in Hungary, they are very bad welcomed. I mean, they don't get any attention. The Hungarian police beat this population and put them into refugees camp without any of their basic needs covered. This is the metro station of Budapest with thousands of refugees that were stuck there. This is an Afghan lady with her daughter. People from Syria again sleeping outside on the floor. The civil population was given then things to cover themselves, or blankets. So in the train rails, as we have seen so many times, as this roadmap to follow to arrive somewhere else. The Hungarian police, there was, at the time, there was not the pandemics, so, but you have to notice that they are using gloves and masks because they're dealing with population that is considered so dangerous. And before that, the lack of will of Europe hosts an infamous percentage, almost nothing. So the countries that are hosting these people are Pakistan, Turkey, Lebanon, and we still are complaining here. And we are seeing how the most vulnerable groups, the migrants, the refugees are being stigmatized and criminalized. So at the summit of the NATO, they talked about immigration as an hybrid threat, and they put it in the same group as the terrorism, something we have to fight against. Where are we placing these persons that are victims of wars that our governments sometimes support, and where many governments of the so-called first world take part in these wars? So we can say our weapons go there and the people come here fleeing from the consequences of those weapons that we send there. So, and then we put these people in these kind of camps where they are tortured. We can see children sleeping like that on the floor when it's freezing. So here we have soldiers that might say, okay, I open the door and I say, you, and you. You can go in like that for no reason. Here, this woman was shouting, was saying, I have a baby. And then, no, the door is closed and then you have to wait for still 2 more hours. So this happens here in Europe. And I'm going to finish. Well, we have also migrants that fly from places where the most developed countries have their factories and their businesses. And here you have the kind of treatment they receive. Hannah Arendt referred to the processes of dehumanization, collective dehumanization. So we've seen that for some vulnerable sectors, the ones we call the others, but it is us too. Dehumanization. So we can see how these countries, the ones we called developing countries, we have sometimes seen attempts to find the truth. So commissions for the truth, like in Rwanda, reparation processes, exhumations, like the ones I have seen in the middle, for instance, in Guatemala or Salvador, in the Middle East as well. And even trials in El Salvador, a country that we could even call a failed state. And at the moment, there are trials. So everything I've been seeing through 20 years has made me make some questions. And this is going to be the finish for me. So why not in my country? Why not in Spain? Why not in my country? So after this long journey, after this circle, I left my country when I was only 22 years old to discover other worlds. And I see how in countries that are poorer than mine and allegedly less developed than mine, some things are happening. And I'm going to finish by talking a little bit about myself, because I am a part of the country. I was born on the 75, who was put in prison in Celorio in the concentration camp, and he suffered 2 simulated shootings. And he was memory that gives us all the parts of this puzzle we have to complete to have an identity. So to the question, why not here, we can have many different questions, many different answers, sorry. So when I come back to Spain, I always seek for answers. And once again, I make the same questions, the questions I had when I was a teenager. And then I seek for the grave of my great-grandparent, who was arrested in León in 1936. He was in the concentration camp of San Marcos. And then one night, as many others, assassinated, killed in Villarangos del Páramo, where there is a mass grave with more than 80 persons. My family has been looking for him for years. And then we have made a long journey through the villages and archives and with any help from the institutions. And then I look for another way and I try to seek for other families. When you have 80 people disappeared and killed, you have a lot of families looking for them. And then we find each other, the families, and we share always the same story, the arrival to Páramos and the denial of the truth by the people from the village. And even the hostility and the people who says, we don't talk about that, nothing happened here, or if something happened, there was a reason. So it has been very difficult for us to find the grave, but we did it. And before we had to go through a voting of the neighborhood board against the exhumation. And this was done at the city hall, and any association decided to stop that. So the announcement of that voting was once again an obstacle, and we had to wait even more. And you know, there are so many families with sisters, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, great-grandchildren. So all this delay made that Rufino Juarez fell at the stairs, that he was so upset. He couldn't believe this happened in 2021, and he finally died, and he wasn't able to recover the remains of his father. So sometimes this is like a terror movie, but it's going to have a happy ending. The one at the corner, that was my great-grandfather, the father of Antonio. Many of the people in this picture was disappeared and killed. That's another family at the mass grave of Villarangos. And this is the Argentinian grandfather of my daughter. My companion is Argentinian, and his father is one of the more than 30,000 people disappeared during the Argentinian dictatorship. My daughter, who is 13, has grown equiparation and neutrality. You know, there is a museum of memory, and there has been trials. And in the trials, her companion, which is my mother-in-law, she had the opportunity to declare, to make a statement. And at the same time, my granddad, Antonio, died some years ago without truth, without justice, and without reparation. I am his granddaughter, and I won't allow this.
Muchas gracias, Olga. Muchas gracias a todas y a todos.
Thank you so much, Olga. Thank you so much to everybody. You know, I have my emotions here on my skin. That's why I didn't introduce you to these to the audience properly. It's because, you know, I was feeling a little bit emotional after all of these speeches. We do not have a few minutes for questions now. Okay, that's too bad. Well, I wanted to share a reflection I've made in relationship to all of this tragedy. That reminds us of this road, Malaga-Almería, and it brings us back, and it shows that this is never ending, and that unfortunately it goes on. You know, it's a shame that on the road in the year 37 we didn't have journalists like Olga, who could have told us about the facts. We had them in Guernica bombing, but we didn't have them in our road to death. I cannot say otherwise. We need to finish now. Thank you all, and especially thank you, Olga.